I want to thank you all for being here today, and I want to thank our speakers for being here, and also for Carol McKinney and Thomas More College for hosting this event. Tonight's topic is going to be specifically about CACR 26, which is a question on the ballot this year, and there are many people that have questions about the CACR 26 and how it all came about and why we need this amendment. And we have some speakers here to my right. Immediate right is Representative Paul Mirski, who is the prime sponsor of this constitutional amendment. You can raise your hand. Yeah, okay. And from that point on, Representative Mirski also is on the Fish and Game Committee.
No, Legislative Administration and Chairman. And,
all right.
I was chair of the district.
Okay, and Representative Itse to the next of them. I'm gonna. What committee are you on?
Constitutional Review and Statutory Recodification.
Wonderful. Representative Sorg to his right.
Yes, I'm vice chair of that very same committee of which Representative Itse is the chair.
Right, and I'll just an added note. Both those state representatives also have come and sat on the Redress of Grievance Committee as well from time to time. And to the far end, Representative Paul Ingbretson, he's my chairman of the Redress of Grievance Committee, and he's done a very good job, and we're very proud of him. And so without any further ado, I'm going to ask Representative Mirski to start this program off to talk about the history of the courts in our Constitution. And so Representative Mirski, would you mind coming up? Yeah.
Thank you.
Right, thank you.
Well, I would have liked to have been chair of Fish and Game. That's what I would have preferred. And my speaker asked me to chair Legislative Administration and then asked me to chair the Special Committee on Redistricting. So I got a lot more work than I'd really bargained for running for office last time around. Look, the deal on the second constitutional amendment that's on the ballot, which is called CACR 26, but it's really number 2 on the ballot, has principally to do with restoring the fundamental right of the people to oversee their judiciary, which we lost as a consequence of passing a different constitutional amendment back in 1978, which is in your Constitution and referenced as Article 73A. Now, I'm not going to get into too much of that part of the debate with respect to the meaning and so forth, but I want to give you some history because we've got some terrific constitutional scholars here that can take off on this and really, I think, help you a lot with the understanding. But I want to give you sort of a layman's perspective on the Constitution, which I think is a correct way to actually look at it, understand its meaning, and interpret what every one of the articles means. When I was first elected in 1994, in December, we're brought in on Organization Day. We take the oath of office, and the oath of office is to defend the New Hampshire Constitution and the United States Constitution. To tell you the truth, I never read the New Hampshire Constitution. And so I thought right after that I'd better find out what it involved primarily, because obviously you can't take an oath without swearing fealty or fulfilling your oath. So that's what I did. And what that leads you to is this. What you're looking for is meaning in every one of the articles and phrases. And if you're familiar with the federal Constitution, which I was familiar with, I'd read all of the historical documents that affect the federal Constitution, and I was particularly fond of the Federalist Papers, and I liked the history of that period. I even grew up in a house where a fellow who built it fought with John Stark at Bennington, a guy named Dudley Gilman. He was a sergeant at that battle, and my brother and I found a bayonet in our house, I remember, when we were kids, which we sharpened up, which the antiquities, which, if you watch Antique Roadshow, that's the wrong thing to do. In any event, so that was a subject that I've always been fascinated with. What happens is when you, in respect to the New Hampshire Constitution, and you begin to read New Hampshire history, you find some unusual things about New Hampshire that really have not been published anywhere. And after you think about these things, you wonder what is going on in the colony, in the province of New Hampshire, at the same time that we're reading all of these polemics out of Massachusetts and further south. And you discover, first of all, that New Hampshire is the place where the first shot was fired in the Revolution. It wasn't Concord, Lexington. It was fired at Fort William and Mary December 14th in 1774. And the first and most important Paul Revere ride wasn't from Boston to Lexington and Concord. It was from Boston to Portsmouth that same month. He rode two days in a snowstorm, sleet storm, terrible weather, to advise the Committee of Safety in Portsmouth that the British had set sail out of Boston to confiscate the powder at Fort William and Mary. And that led to a group of alarm going up in the locality. 400 men gathered at the fort. A couple shots were fired. Nobody was killed. There were only 7 men in the fort. But the crowd prevailed their neighbors who were guarding the fort to let them in. And they confiscated all the powder the first day, and they took the weapons the next day. And it's said that there were barrels of powder in all the congregational churches in the Seacoast area, which is where they were hidden. And just an amusing thing, in addition, when the pilot who directed the British ships into the harbor brought them in, he got them stranded on a sandbar, which made it kind of hard for the British to do much about that momentary insurrection. So the first shot is fired 4 months, actually almost 5 months, before the Battle of Concord, Lexington. Next you learn is that in June, John Stark had more men at the Battle of Bunker Hill than Massachusetts did. He brought 1,250 men to fight on the beach at Bunker Hill. He saved the Massachusetts contingent that was on the top of the hill in the retreat. Why does New Hampshire have more people at Bunker Hill than the province of Massachusetts, or the province of Connecticut, or the province of Rhode Island? Why? You ask yourself these questions, or Connecticut. You ask yourself why. The next thing you learn is that in 1776, in 1775, the Continental Congress told the delegates to the convention, go on out and write your own constitution as soon as possible. New Hampshire is the first province out of the box, the first colony, to write a constitution in January 1775. That's what, 7 months before the Declaration of Independence. Why is that? How can that be? And then what you learn is that once the fight moved south to New York, and then to New Jersey, and then on south into the Carolinas, this Great War. In New Hampshire, during all this time, when the entire region, entire North America is in conflict, what are they doing in New Hampshire? They're rewriting their first constitution because they felt it was really, it was way too autocratic, and that it ought to be more egalitarian. And I don't know, Dan could probably tell you how many times it was submitted for review by the people, but for virtually the entire duration of the war and then beyond, they were arguing about what kind of government they were going to have here. A bunch of constitutional conventions, a bunch of submissions for votes. We were the first constitution to have a constitution in 1776. We were the last one to actually adopt a constitution in 1784. I think that's correct. Dan can correct me if I'm wrong. So you say, what is going on here that this colony would take this so seriously? And what you learn, I think, from looking at the history of New Hampshire, that we were quite different from the beginning. This colony was established as a commercial venture out on the Isles of Shoals, Gosport. And from the beginning, that's what it was, a commercial venture. New Hampshire was never a religious venture. And then as time moved on and as the colony grew, it became a real estate venture, still commercial. I read a book once by Bernard Balin having to do with the peopling of North America, where they came from and where they went when they got here. And I was startled to learn that that in New England, the folks who came to live in New England actually came here with money in their pocket and the ability to buy land, which was not available to them really in England, right? But they were able to somehow gather resources, borrow resources, come over in ships and acquire property. So property rights became very important, were very important, the motivation there. You get to the middle part of the country around New York, you discover there are lots of indentured servants, people with no money, came to New York and became involved as laborers or indentured servants to earn their way, to find some way to earn money to eventually buy property. And when you get down into the Carolinas and southern regions, you find that there are large plantations, which are large land grants by the king. So you have 3 different constituencies. So when I have to be careful about time, but when you read the polemics of the era and you see what Sam Adams wrote, what John Adams wrote, what they talk about is really Lockean ideals having to do with rights of property, these batch of individual rights, which actually become the first part of our Constitution. When you get down into the middle colonies, you find that Thomas Paine's ideas about individual liberty were the ones that really caught people's imagination because they had no property, but they were interested in their individual liberty. And way up here in New Hampshire, as I said, at the very end of this long train of colonies, out really in the wilderness, we have an extremely large population of Scotch-Irish who come to this colony. They're devout Lockeans. They believe in virtually everything John Locke wrote, debunking the dividing right of kings, etc. So what we wind up with is a really, really unusual and unique constitution, different from all of the others. This is the only constitution in the country that really begins with a Bill of Rights, an egalitarian Bill of Rights. Before they even talk about how they form government, which is what the United States Constitution is, it's a description of how government is formed. We start off with a long litany of rights. I think there's 38, 39 now that we've added to the Constitution. And only after they've exhausted themselves do they talk about what kind of government, how government's going to operate, what the executive will look like, what the judiciary will look like, and what the House and Senate will look like. That's pretty interesting. You can't do anything in the legislature without thinking about this long litany of prescriptions at the beginning of the Constitution. So when you think about this and you read the document, what you discover is that this Constitution is very egalitarian. It gives all the power to the people. It gives virtually no power to the governor. And it gives no power to the judiciary, except that with respect to judges, it places ultimate confidence in their discretion with respect to running their courtrooms and determining the outcomes of cases. But it doesn't create a judiciary in the sense that we have, for example, in Washington with the Supreme Court and all the apparatus. All the power goes to the people, and that's why, and not only that, but because it's so property tax driven, what you find, and I'll tell you why that is, you find that the laws and structures are really aimed at, well, they're aimed at property, I just said it. Most of the towns that were developed after 1761 at the end of the French and Indian War in New Hampshire come after 1761 because the interior of this state was uninhabitable due to Indian wars from the very beginning, from 1630 on until 1761. That was continuous Indian war in the interior. The French and the English used the tribes to vie for power in North America, and it was simply unhealthy to live in the middle of the state. And if you want to read your history, you'll find all kinds of stories of abductions, individuals taken to Montreal and ransomed and brought back. The story of Hannah Dustin is all about that. So in 1761, we had a governor, Benny Wentworth, who was very interested in making some money. He turned New Hampshire into really the Florida of the 18th century. The entire state went up for sale. I think he charted maybe 70 towns, something like that. And in every town, there was property that was even given to churches or municipalities or to Benny Wentworth himself. So he stood to make a great deal of money. And these towns were in corporations, so they were business corporations where there were partners, and those partners had to conform to a contract with the governor. They had to produce a community. If there were, and they had to have a town meeting very shortly in order to justify their existence. So all these towns had investors who had a commercial interest in their future. And the Constitution reflects, in the number of members of the legislature, the interest of all of these individuals from these towns. What the legislature wanted was, and what the people wanted, was to have their town, their investors, represented in this legislature. And in fact, the idea of town legislation, town representation in the assembly, in the 1760s, probably because of this great new movement toward development, caused the towns in the seacoast to petition the king to be relieved of this power that the governor had, which was the ability to veto any individual that a community chose to serve in the colonial assembly. 3 years after that petition went to the king, it came back with a denied, basically, on it. And it infuriated the small towns, it infuriated the investors, and it became probably the principal motivator for all of those things I mentioned to you earlier. The first shot, the number of people at Bunker Hill, the first Constitution, this huge debate throughout the remainder of the war over the form of our own Constitution. So what I want to leave you with in this initial kind of introduction is this. This state has always been interested in individual liberty, in the preservation of property, in community right, the importance of small community government, individual and that the power in this state ought to reside with the people and not with the institutions of the judiciary and the executive. And one last thing, to just emphasize that, go back and read your history of Massachusetts about the time that Sam Adams was beginning to write his polemics, and look into John Hutchinson, who was both the vice governor, lieutenant governor, excuse me, and the chief of the Supreme Court in Massachusetts. Look at the corruption south of us, and it will tell you a great deal about why our Constitution looks so different from anyone else's. I think I ought to get Dan Itse up here to talk to you about this in maybe a little bit more detail. But that's the way the playing field exists as I see it in 1784. And then you can you'll see where this develops from that.
Thank you, Paul. What I'm going to try and do is inspire you to take your rightful place in this government. Well, Paul touched on it. He talked about how we had the first constitution of any of the colonies. It's actually a much bigger statement than that. On December 21st, 1775, our legislature sat down to write a constitution. They did so because they had scared Governor Wentworth out of the colony. He had been harboring a loyalist militia officer, and the people wanted to, I don't know, probably ride him out of town on a rail, and they rolled a cannon up to the governor's front door. And in July, and he, I don't know whether he turned the officer over or not, but after that point, he decided that probably New Hampshire was not the place he wanted to be, and he left and went to Nova Scotia, where he again became the royal governor. But now we have a state where effectively New Hampshire is without a government. And they started having problems with anarchy in the outlying areas of New Hampshire. And so our legislature got together on December 21st, kind of just before Christmas. I guess other legislatures take Christmas off, but they decided to stay in session. And by January 5th, 15 days later, they had produced a government, the first government in the history of the world, created by a written constitution. That is enormously significant. Now, this was not a constitution ratified by the people. And they wrote it as a temporary document to tide them through this unhappy conflict, as they coined it. But it's interesting to look at why they formed this government. And this is really the nugget of what we're driving at with CACR 26. Or question 2, as you'll see it on the ballot. Why did we form New Hampshire? The sudden and abrupt departure of His Excellency John Wentworth, Esquire, our late governor, and several of the council, leaving us destitute of legislation, and no executive courts being open to punish criminal offenders, whereby the lives and properties of the honest people of this colony are liable to the machinations and evil designs of wicked men. Therefore, for the preservation of peace and good order, and for the security of the lives and properties of the inhabitants of this colony, we conceive ourselves reduced to the necessity of establishing a form of government. The purpose of the government of New Hampshire is to punish injustice. The sole purpose. Everything else we do up in Concord, building bridges, providing roads, helping the poor, whatever else we may do, it is all secondary to that first purpose of providing justice. Providing statutes that provide a fixed law so that people know when they are breaking the law, or what might cause them to break the law, an executive department to apprehend the evildoers, and a judiciary to mete out justice. That's why we're there. A few years later, the war, it being apparent that the war was not going to drift away as they thought it all would. In 79, we again had a first. Now, our first constitution, all the constitutions of the other states, were created by their legislatures, not by the people. John Langdon, Speaker of the Assembly at that point, decided to try something new, a constitutional convention. Why is this important? When you have a constitution written by the legislature, it is a constitution that is perceived from the power of government. When you have a constitution written by an external body, it may include legislators, it probably does, but it includes people who are not legislators. And therefore, the power that they're dealing with is viewed not as the power of the government, but the power of the people. The first constitutional convention in the history of the world, July of 1779. Massachusetts did not hold theirs until September. We rejected our first proposed constitution, in part because the Bill of Rights was too small. It had only 7 articles. And because it was a recodification of that concentrated form of government that they had, an assembly, a House of Representatives, from which was chosen an executive council, from which was chosen a chief executive, a president of the state, who also happened to be the Chief Justice of the courts. And they thought this was a little overly concentrated. The second, so 2 years later, that was rejected in 1781. They proposed a new one with pretty much the Bill of Rights that we have now, other than the amendments we've made in the last 200-odd years, and what I would call a truly American form of government with a directly elected executive, House of Representatives, and a Senate. People looked at that, they said, that's radical. That's way too radical for us. So the third try kept the same Bill of Rights, but with a more parliamentary form of government. House, Senate, Executive Council, comprised of 3 members of the House and 2 members of the Senate, elected in joint session. Secretary of State and Treasurer elected by the legislature in joint session, and a directly elected president who was also the president of the Senate and a voting senator. That's what the people approved. That's a long way of saying we are the only jurisdiction that has ever rejected a proposed constitution. We are unique. We rejected 2 proposed constitutions. We are a persnickety people, as some people say. Now, where does that power in government come from? You all easily would say, well, where does the power in government come from? Somebody shout out. How do you know? It says so. All power residing originally in and being derived from the people. All the magistrates, executive department, judges, and officers of the government are their substitutes and agents and at all times accountable to them. The power we wield and conquered is not ours, it is yours. We are your representatives. When we are in Concord, we are your deputies. A deputy is somebody who exercises all the power of the office holder. We are your deputies. We propose and pass laws that presumably you want, and if you don't, you replace us. Who is the final judge of the meaning of the Constitution? How do you know? It says so, right. Article 39, what was originally the last article in our Constitution. It is great. Not only does it affirm the power of the people to interpret the Constitution, not the judges, it also gives you a voter's guide. Article 38. And you have to understand, recur. Recur means to read, study, and discuss. The Constitution is not a document written for lawyers to interpret. I'm an engineer. The Constitution was written for the people to ratify. Therefore, the people must be able to understand it. And it says, a frequent recurrence to the fundamental principles of the Constitution, to read, study, and discuss. It should be, what you talking about in Walmart? I do. And a constant adherence to justice, moderation, temperance, industry, and frugality are indispensably necessary to the preservation of liberty and good government. Not a good idea, not convenient, indispensably necessary. You must know your Constitution. If you don't know your Constitution, how do you interpret it? How do you enforce it? The next phrase is the voter's guide. The people ought therefore, and ought is the moral imperative, the people ought therefore to have a particular regard to those principles in the selection of their officers and representatives. So you're to use that document, the Constitution, as a measure of whom you set and conquered. You see your prospective representatives at the polls, and they say, "Oh, vote for me." How many parts are there to the Constitution? If they don't know, don't vote for them. So what do you think about Article 8? What does it mean to you? If they don't know what Article 8 is, that they're dealing with your power, don't vote for them. And they, the people, have a right to require of their lawgivers and magistrates, executive department, judges, an exact and constant observance of them, those principles, in the formation and execution of the laws necessary for the good administration of government. I love finding these little hooks in there. It's the administration of government. We aren't the government. You're the government. We're the administrators. We're the hirelings. We're up there doing your will. We're executing your power. Now, we are also members of the community, so when we're in Concord, we're executing 1/400th of 1/2 of the power. In the community, we hold 1/1,000,000th of the power, a little less than. But that's how this Constitution was meant to be looked at. Now we come to CACR 26, or question 2. Now, until 1964, the legislature had the power to constitute all the judicatories of the state. Every court in the state was at the mercy of the legislature. And in fact, the legislature, from time to time, has wiped all the chess pieces off the board. Usually it was done for political purposes. The legislature and the executive would change hands. You'd go from, well, the equivalent of Republican to Democrat and Democrat to Republican. It's happened 5 times. And each time you'd have, well, the first time was funny. It was 1816. The Republican Democrats take power. They wipe out the judiciary and reconstitute the courts and appoint new judges. And the people did not like the new judges. They continued to go to the old judges. 2 years later, 2 election cycles, the Federalists get reelected. And again, off go the pieces from the chessboard. They create all new courts. 1964, a little late to the table because the last time this had happened was 1873. A little late to the table, but it's proposed in that convention, just so this doesn't happen again, that we create 2 constitutional courts, the Supreme and Superior Courts. They would no longer be at the mercy of the legislature. They would no longer be creatures of the legislature. In 1978, there was another constitutional amendment proposed for the purpose of insulating the judiciary from politics. Article 73A. And Article 73A, well, it reads, and this, it is important how it reads, and I'll have, because it has been misread. Article 73A says, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court shall be the administrative head of all the courts. He shall, with the concurrence of the majority of the Supreme Court justices, make the rules governing the administration of all courts in the state and the practice and procedure to be followed in all such courts. The rules so promulgated shall have the force and effect of law. Now, up until that point, at least throughout the 20th century, the rules for the administration of the courts had been proposed in the superior courts, and they'd be handed up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court would approve those rules. This resulted in slight discrepancies in the rules from county to county. Interestingly enough, I suspect it would have been possible for the Supreme Court to unify those rules, but they chose not to. However, in order to ensure that the rules in all the counties would be uniform, Article 73A was proposed. Now, in that convention, one of the members, I believe it was Representative Delegate Niswander, was very concerned about that last sentence, rules so promulgated will have the force and effect of law. And he says, now, he says, this won't diminish or the power of the legislature, the power that the legislature currently has to regulate the practice and procedure in the courts, will it? And Delegate Gross says, as far as I can tell, they will have every power they currently enjoy. That's very important. Up until that point, we had made a large fraction, and in the early days of the state, all of the rules for the practice and procedure of the court, down to how much a lawyer might get paid in certain types of routine filings. So we see that in the convention, they had been reassured that this would not diminish the power of the legislature at all. Unfortunately, that last sentence was not included on the ballot in 1978 because it wasn't necessary. The only thing that was required by law was a synopsis or an explanation of the amendment. And it did not include the last sentence. This has caused a great deal of confusion and back and forth in the years since. So much so that in the, I think my first term, 2001, 2002, we did pass a law that said you have to put the amendment on the ballot so the people see what's going to be in the Constitution. Since the adoption of Article 73A, despite the words of Delegates Niswander and Gross, the Supreme Court of New Hampshire has interpreted Article 73A to mean that the legislature has no power to affect the practice and procedure in the courts whatsoever. Now, this is a real problem. Remember, whose power is the court exercising? The people's. If you if you ever get a chance to read it, Bastiat, the law. Government cannot exercise any power that does not originally reside in the people. Government is merely an aggregate of the power of the people, so it can be wielded more effectively. So if it's your power, and the Supreme Court should write a rule or execute a rule in a manner that you, the people, don't feel is good or just, how do you change it? It is not rational that the government should be able to deny you the power to control your power that they're executing. But that is what the Supreme Court has been doing for the last 30 years. In fact, and this is even more disturbing in my mind, is that during the 1980s, when the legislature was trying to create court rules in regard to contempt of court, the Supreme Court began opining that some of these powers, and particularly because of the inclusion of Article 73A, that these powers, legislative powers they claim, to control the practice and procedure in the courts are inherent to the court, inherent to the judiciary. And I want you to construct what that means. If our Constitution says that all power originates in and is derived from the people, a claim of inherent power is akin to really synonymous with a claim of divine right. They are, in fact, claiming a power of divine right, or divine government by divine power. They wouldn't say it that way. Confronted with it, I don't know how they would react to it. But that's the long and short of it. They perceive their power to control their courts beyond the reach of the people. And that is inherently dangerous to you. The proposed question on the ballot, which is actually the language provided by the judiciary, restores your power to control how your power is executed in the courts through your elected legislature. The Supreme Court is going to say, oh, but there's a separation of powers. And this is one of those things that's really, really interesting. Because Article 37, and that's the wrong part of the Constitution, Article 37, Part 1, I can probably do it pretty close off the top of my head anyway. The three powers of government, to wit, the legislative, executive, and judicial, ought to be kept as separate from and independent of each other as the nature of free government will admit. That recognizes that in order to have free government, there must be an overlap of powers. Or as is consistent with that chain of connection that binds the whole fabric of the Constitution in one indissoluble bond of unity and amity, which is the instruction of how to read the Constitution. In order to read the Constitution correctly, you must look at all of the articles that touch upon the article you're interested in. Because however you interpret it, it must be consistent with all those other articles, because they are one indissoluble bond of unity and amity. They are friendly to each other. They are in agreement. So if you want to find out how one branch of the government relates to another, you read the form of government, and it tells you. It tells you that the legislature is the supreme legislative body. If the legislature is the supreme legislative body, how can the court create a rule with the force and effect of law that the legislature cannot amend? Is that rational? I know that I have to give up the mic to my vice chair and good colleague, Representative Sorg, and I hope to be able to take questions later. Thank you.
Oh, boy. I don't know whether these glasses are going to do me any good or not. I'm getting to the point where my vision is so bad that whether I wear my bifocals or whether I wear my contact lenses aided by reading glasses, it still doesn't do me much good. So I bring notes here just as a security blanket, but really rather useless. The last time I spoke before a group of colleges, it was at Plymouth State College exactly a month ago today. It was in connection with Constitution Day, which was a week late. And it was in one of those big, giant lecture halls, and there may be 70, 80 people in there. And I kind of pictured that's what this would be. But this is not bad at all, because when I went there, I was picturing us being in like a hockey arena full of like 20,000 people. I don't know why I had that thought, because maybe it was because the conventions had just passed and I was used to seeing people present in that way. But this is nice. This is a very, very intimate group. Why I say that is because I come prepared for almost anything. I've got a little book there I've been referring to from time to time, which I've got all sorts of materials. If we were doing this with each of us speaking for 3 hours, I'd be ready to do it. And that's easy, really. That's easier than trying to keep it short. And so on the way down, knowing I wasn't going to have much more than 20 minutes, and that's what they told us, right, 20 minutes, in order to discipline myself, I took down some notes, which I'm going to have a great deal of trouble reading, and wrote them down as I was writing, which is probably just as bad as texting. But I wanted to explain a couple things before I get into this. I'm dressed a little differently from my colleagues tonight, and that was deliberate, because what has motivated me in preparing my remarks for tonight is I'll admit it right up front, it's anger. I'm an attorney, and as an attorney, I'm required to be a member of the New Hampshire Bar because of judicial fiat, because they claim authority to make us do that. It's one of the number of things they claim authority to do, which they really don't have, as Representative Itse has tried to explain to you. And so they're coming out against this amendment, claiming it threatens the separation of powers. And they did the same thing in 2004 when we had a similar amendment proposed. And I wanted to dress like just a regular person to kind of emphasize what you've been told by Representatives Mirski and Itse, that we're not some kind of a bunch of yahoos that just sneaked in a guerrilla style and took over the government, invading the palace, and we're going to set up a government by coup d'etat. We're the people's representatives. We stand for election every 2 years. We get paid $100 a year. I don't know if everybody knows that. This is a volunteer legislature, and it's almost the only one left. And the idea that all 400 of us in the House and the 24 in the Senate, and aided and abetted by the governor, whoever that may be, are going to somehow be able to work a total revolution and assume all the power, not only of the legislative branch, but of the judicial branch, is just so much nonsense. And the fact that this comes from the New Hampshire Bar Association in an editorial they put in the Bar News, which I received yesterday, is just so frustrating to me. These people, of whom I'm an unwilling member, they're a bunch of nimrods, to put it quite frankly. They don't understand the Constitution, and they're not alone, because the justices themselves don't understand it very well. We were taught as kids, Santa Claus brings toys on Christmas, Easter Bunny brings eggs on Easter, and the Supreme Court has final authority on the meaning of the Constitution that's binding and final on the legislative branch. Well, I'll tell you, at least one of those is false, and it's the third one, and you've seen why that is so. But we've become so conditioned by the claims repeatedly made over the years, not by our court at first, but by the federal court, of such power, dating from Marbury versus Madison, and never challenged effectively by the legislative branch, because so many people are just so clueless about the Constitution that it's just become accepted fact. And we read helplessly in the papers or hear on television about how the courts made this or that ruling, and that's it. That's the meaning of the Constitution, and that's not correct. I'm looking at these notes here. The way my friends in the Bar Association would have you believe it, and as former Chief Justice Broderick put it when he and I were on the Exchange on NPR, I guess it was a week ago. We're somehow able, all 424 of us, to work this revolution in our government to corrupt the whole process. And I have to put it to you, just a little perspective here. The Supreme Court has 5 members, all right? We have 424. They have salaries, so they don't have to be distracted by any other pursuits in life. They make, I think their pay is $133,000 a year. That's not with benefits. they also have benefits. We get $100 a year. We don't get any benefits. We can pay for our own health insurance through the state system, but that's just like a regular family policy. I can't afford it, so I haven't bought into it. And of course, we don't have any pensions. Once we're out, we're out. They are a very homogeneous group. They are the elite lawyers, and they come from the usual schools around here, primarily Boston University or Boston College, whereas we come from all sorts of backgrounds. It's astonishing, as I've gotten to know various members, how diverse our backgrounds are, how diverse our experience, and it makes the process of legislating a very rich one, a very rewarding one, but also a very frustrating one, because we see the world so differently. I'm an attorney, Representative Mirski is an architect, Representative Itse, as he told you, is an engineer, and Representative Ingbretson is an artist. He paints portraits. That reflects the legislature as a whole. It's just amazing, the backgrounds they have. But it makes it rather difficult to form a conspiracy when you have 400 people of such diverse backgrounds. And as opposed to the court, where you have 5 people who see life very much the same. They're like the elite of the elite. You know, we go to law school, we think we're pretty smart people. We got good grades on the LSAT, and we managed to get through the hard way, you know, by graduating, and we passed bars. And I've passed 2 of them. Aren't I special? By the way, I was thinking on the way, you know, Abraham Lincoln never went to law school. I don't know if you know that, but we're a credential-crazed society, so that's very important. So I'm bragging here. I've got the credentials. So I'm a member of the elite. But you know, the judges, though, they're the elite of the elite, and they see the world differently from just the mere elite like me. Because as smart as I think I am, I'm not so smart that I think I know how to live your lives better than you do. But there comes a point when you become so smart that you start becoming stupid again, and you really believe that you know better how other people should live. And that's a disease to which the courts in this country are prone. And that's why they make so many policy decisions these days and overrule the legislatures. And that's even after they dictate what the election laws should be. They don't think the election process is pure enough, so they're dictating how we shall hold elections. And yet, having done that, they are not willing to abide by the results of the process of the legislators that they want to get elected according to their rules. So that's what we're confronted with, a judiciary that is so sure of its intellectual superiority and so hostile, not just suspicious, but actually hostile to representative government. It's very disturbing. So now, let's go to the Constitution again. Article 72A, that's the one that Representative Itse referred to that established the Supreme and Superior Courts as constitutional courts. And it reads, and I don't know the exact wording, but it says, the judicial power of the state, something like this, the judicial power of the state shall be in a Supreme Court and the Superior Courts. What is judicial power? Well, very simply, judicial power is nothing more than the right to, the authority to hear and decide cases. That's it. That's it. And that's why Alexander Hamilton in the Federalist number 78 said that in his opinion, the judicial branch is the least dangerous branch, because that's all it has. It just has judgment. And it has to depend upon the legislative branch for its funding to pay their salaries and to provide them with the facilities in which they do their hearing and their judging. And they depend upon the executive branch to carry out their decisions. But as things have developed over the years, the judges have come to believe that they have all sorts of additional powers. I think former Chief Justice Brock actually said an opinion, I didn't have time to find it, where he said the court has inherent power to do all things necessary to see to its survival. You know, it's like a Darwinian kind of thing. So they could assert any kind of authority they want to be able to carry out their function, and unfortunately, that's just not how it is. But they've come to accept that so much that what we're trying to do here to get the legislature involved in what is essentially a legislative function, it isn't just essentially a legislative function, it is a legislative function. Rulemaking is a legislative function. And yet, we trying to interpose ourselves in this again is somehow a threat to the judicial power. Okay. Judicial acts. What's a judicial act? Well, a judicial act is ruling on a case. A legislative act is setting rules for to govern future cases. In other words, a judicial act is one where you are settling a dispute between parties to the court under the rules then in effect. A legislative act is setting rules to govern future disputes. Very, very simple, and that's the distinction that was laid down in a seminal case, Merrill versus Sherburne. In this case, it's often called the Marbury versus Madison of New Hampshire, but that's like so many claims of that sort. It's an exaggeration, and but that certainly fits in with the the Black's Law Dictionary definitions of the two things. So that the judiciary has power over judicial acts, legislature over legislative acts, and somehow for us to propose to reimpose our power, even to the point of preeminence over what the court rules should be, threatens the separation of powers and the independence of the judiciary. I'm having trouble being coherent about this because it just boggles my mind that people would not recognize how foolish that is, and yet the former Chief Justice believes that. The former Governor Merrill believes that, and they've editorialized on it. Former Justice Nato, and so here we are. Now, I brought among all those papers, I brought up here to show you, which I have trouble doing, a list of chapters. These are chapters of the revised statutes annotated, not just individual statutes, but whole chapters which contain many statutes. And these are RSA chapters that relate to court procedure. These are enactments we did. The legislature's been doing this for 2 centuries. But to hear them talking about it now, we're doing something entirely new. I can't read them, but I count 8 chapters towards the end. From chapter 506, wait a minute. A lawyer who can't read. From chapter, title 52, Actions, Process, and Service of Process, goes from chapter 506, Prevention of Frauds and Perjuries, through chapter 513, Arrest and Bail. All rules laid down by legislation to govern court procedure. Title 53 is even more direct. The title of that chapter is Proceedings in Court, and it goes from chapter 514, Notice, Default, and Abatement, to RSA chapter 526, New Trials. Title 54, Executions, Levies, Bail, and the Relief of Poor Debtors. Execution means enforcement of judgments, doesn't mean hanging people. And that runs from chapter 527, Executions, through chapter 533, Relief of Poor Debtors. Title 58, Proceedings in Special Cases, running from chapter 534, Habeas Corpus, all the way through chapter 546B, Uniform Interstate Family Support Act. There's just all sorts of this stuff, and so I would just leave you with a couple of thoughts. One is, given the small number, the homogeneous nature, the salaries, the fact that they deliberate in secret, that characterizes the judicial branch, compared with the legislative branch, which has 424 members. Everything we do is in public. We have public hearings on every bill. Our executive sessions in the committees are public sessions. We vote in public sessions in the full House. And then when you get a bill through the House, the whole process starts over again in the Senate. And then even then, the governor has to concur. You compare how we do our business compared with the courts, how the court does its business, and you have to ask yourself, if one branch is going to be conspiring to undermine the form of government we have, which is the one more likely to be in the process of doing that, the legislative or the judicial? And I'll stop there. Thanks very much. And defer to my friend, Representative Ingbretson.
Thank you, Representative Sorg. It won't stand up by itself, huh? It's a distraction. I I think of this as I'm the fourth guy up here. I think I'm doing cleanup. Except instead of thinking of myself as Alex Rodriguez, I think of myself as a janitor. This is always great what these guys bring to us. I could, if I think of myself as an artist, say I'm actually trying to bring some unity to this, but I can't. They already have unified it all, and I'm going to have to just bring some color. Is that okay? We do that good, though. I'm a Boston School guy, and color is where we start. Believe it or not, for those 3 or 4 students of yours that work under my one of my students over there, do I know some of you guys in here? I might already, huh? Yeah, there you are. Hi. Let's see where to start. I'm chairman of the Redress of Grievance Committee. And I'll talk to you about that as a primary issue here now today. This is, I'm not good with this part of it. I'm wearing my arm. I don't even hold a palette in my arm like some guys do. I prefer to keep it down on a table. We're out my arm. But let's just talk a little bit about a couple things here. First of all, I do believe that the most beautiful thing that's been invented by way of government is representational government. And I think the next most beautiful thing, and twice as beautiful as that, is representative government that actually has a process called redress of grievances. There are only 4 states in the entire nation that have that built into their constitution. I met one of the representatives from, I think it was Maryland, who has it. And I said, so what do you guys do with redress? Are you from down there? And I said, so what do you guys do with redress? And he said, do what? And he said, well, what's redress? And I said, well, I guess maybe you don't do anything with it. Do you have a committee, perhaps a standing committee on redress of grievances? And he said, well, I don't think so. I've never heard of redress of grievances. And I said, you might want to read your constitution. So New Hampshire used to have it, used to do a lot with it, and used to do a lot of slapping back at the judiciary with it. And it shows up in various ways throughout our history until, of course, you get to Merrill versus Sherburne, which I wish I had sort of elaborated on, because I'm not good at the details of Merrill versus Sherburne, but we find it to be rather an interesting interpretation that begins to draw a net around redress of grievances, fascinatingly enough. But where would you get a greater accountability in relation to government abuses than in a redress process that's guaranteed? And I brought before you, and I hope I can get my reading eyes working here, I brought before you Articles 31 and 32, and I want to read them to you, just to give you the background. You know, there's a way, I hope you'll understand why I'm talking about this, because it's directly related to the courts, but it's not, or it's indirectly related to the courts, but it's, I think you'll see as we get toward the end of this that there's a necessity in relation to question 2 that comes out of the redress of grievance experience. But nevertheless, let me read you Articles 31 and 2. They're really short, but this is how beautiful, this is as beautiful as representative government gets. Article 31 says, meeting of legislature for what purpose? The legislature shall assemble for the redress of public grievances and for making such laws as the public good may require. You notice how it separated it. One of the great grievances of the courts is that we have no clue about separation of powers, and yet that power was given to us while the courts existed. We created courts and we created redress of grievances. So it's a fascinating situation we're dealing with. But the second point is more beautiful even yet than the first one, and that says, rights of assembly, instruction, and petition. The people have a right in an orderly and peaceable manner to assemble and consult upon the common good, give instructions to the representatives, and to request of the legislative body, by way of petition or remonstrance, redress of the wrongs done them and of the grievances they suffer. Do you think they mean the wrongs done them by their neighbors? It's not that, right? That's taken care of by the courts. You take, a person injures you, there's a prosecuting attorney, or there's, you take somebody to court. This has to do with wrongdoing by the people, by the houses, by the agencies, by the authorities in either branch. And so as I said, what could be more beautiful than a representative government? That's one that has redress, that actually has that ability. I understand the federal Constitution has it, and it's never been used one time. I understand there's a group now down in Washington trying to get redress because they believe the IRS is a complete fraud and have 384 questions put together by 80-some scholars in law that they really need answers to, and I think it's a brilliant moment. But they're having to go through this whole process of forcing redress of grievances, and it's taken them years, 3 or 4 or 5 years now, where they're just trying to get redress of that grievance. Well, in New Hampshire, there was a difficulty similarly, where we were simply trying to get redress. So Representative Itse and I tried to create a process. We found there was no process. Several people came in, by the way, and they're mostly coming in from the family division, which is another long story, and I'll give you a short answer to that part. But we found so we dragged them over to the legislative services, and we said, look, we want to write a petition. And they said, what? We don't have that. There's nothing in statute that shows us how to do that, or we don't even have a process of any kind. So we find we had lost a process that had been in existence from the beginning, which had been used from the beginning, and that about 1925 was maybe the last time it was used, right? And we do believe that Merrill versus Sherburne was the major factor in probably altering that. There's no process. So Representative Itse and myself authored a bill in which we created a process, which was turned down by the Judiciary Committee, which is, of course, maybe that were you there at the time, Representative Sorg? No? Yeah, you would have helped it to happen, so where was I? I can't carry on a personal conversation. Remember, I'm stay on track. So yeah. At any rate, they were happening, and they were happening again and again. Now, what had happened is we had all sorts of methods for it. We would actually create a special committee, et cetera, et cetera. Well, we actually finally did get something done in the House, and the House created a way of operating, and they were going to accept redresses. So what did we do? We accepted redress. We accepted petitions for redress of grievance into the House. That was under the Democrats a couple of years ago. And what did we do with them? We stuck them in a filing cabinet. We read their titles and a very abbreviated title, by the way, and we stuck them in a filing cabinet. And that was it. That was you got your right. Does it say that, right? To have written something somewhere and have it stuck in a filing cabinet? No, the right to be heard, right? So it was a fascinating thing and a major change. Well, by the way, and I should say this, that Speaker of the House in those days said to her chairman, one of whom wanted to pull one of them off and actually listen to the redress, said, you don't be doing that. You won't be doing that. That person then went off and decided she was going to try to listen to these people on the street sort of thing, and she was pulled from her chairmanship, and the next year she lost her position on that committee. The committee that she'd been in forever and ever. So there's a direct relationship. I asked her about it, whether that was true, and she said, I'm not saying anything. I'm happy with the committee I'm on. Things can get worse, I guess. So that was a big surprise. However, in the last House, at the very beginning, Speaker of the House, O'Brien, who had sat in on a number of these. I'm sorry, I didn't tell you this one part. We created our own little caucus on redress of grievances. We tried to call it a committee, and they were chastised for that. So we were advised to call it a caucus on redress of grievances. We began to actually hear these things, and we're mind blown by what was happening. And I better make this shorter and just get to the point, and that is that biggest part of the problems were coming out of the courts, as you can imagine. So when they finally, when Representative O'Brien, who became Speaker, he created this committee right at the beginning of the year, made a standing committee, and appointed yours truly chairman, which I wasn't asking for, I didn't have time for, and still don't have time for. But we began to then listen to these things, and it was a major eye-opener for everybody. But I want to say, when we were doing the caucus, Representative O'Brien had been there, had listened to this stuff, he was well aware of it. And we believed, all of us believed together, that it was our duty under the Constitution, our sworn duty, actually, to not only let them write it on a piece of paper, but actually listen to it. So that standing committee, the first year we received, I think, 33 overall. It looked like it was going to be 33. It turned into a total of 27 that we heard, half of which were coming out of the courts and problems within the courts. And the unbelievable failures, I mean, literally failures of due process. A guy would come to a hearing and find out the hearing had been changed in its content to being a hearing about the amount of money he was going to be paying his wife in a divorce to whether he's ever going to see his kid again. So it was a question of custody and a completely inexplicable a switch of hearings without a notice, the type of hearing without a notice. And the guy would lose rights. And in one case, guys lost his rights on the spot, and 2 years later still hadn't seen his child again. And then there are these 6 months while you're waiting, of course, to then get your next hearing and that sort of thing. But due process across the board, not just one type, but all kinds of them were coming through to us. And of course, there were other issues, but the ones that tonight are just really, truly related to the courts. So what I wanted to point out, though, is that, actually, I think I'll just leave it with that. But so one of the we started looking through the rules and that sort of thing. We found out that one of the rules was Rule 1.2. And Rule 1.2 says there are no rules. That say all rules may be waived. Well, the injustice of it was bad enough. It actually allowed that you could waive rules, but you need to explain it. Well, they weren't even bothering to explain it. Because if there are no rules, then why is waiving a requirement? Can't you waive all rules? I mean, it's the most mind-blowing crap, to put it in artistic terms, yeah. So that would be bad enough. Now, the courts, if they're really managing this, would have said, what the heck are we doing? And the interesting thing was, one judge did say to me, he said, I was at one of these hearings in a courtroom, and he said to me, you know, you guys did this. You created this problem. And I had no idea. He wouldn't tell me anymore. I asked him what the heck he's talking about, and he never would tell me. So eventually, in a brainstorm, after a whole 2 years of all these hearings and finding out more and more and more of this stuff, and here, it was all wrong. It was just random court operation. Stuff that, in my opinion, the court should have been not doing, despite the fact that we had made a major mistake. But they knew, and they weren't telling us about it. And the major mistake was a real simple one. We created equity courts. We created courts that say all laws and rules to the contrary notwithstanding. And then they have the judge will do whatever the heck it pleases, more artistic terms used, it might be useful. So, and so that's where we, as a court now, as a general court, are saying, okay, so we're going to correct this, right? We're going to correct Rule 1.2, for example. And what's the court going to do with it? Are they going to interpret it out of our hands? They're going to say, what are you guys doing? You don't have that power under 28A? 28A? 73A? That's right. Yeah. Too many of these. So do you follow what I'm saying? Now, what we have found through this process is we found that we created an equity court, and we need to get rid of it. We created the court. We can get rid of it. But is the court going to grab some other power in relation to courts and assert some other new power and take that right away from us? We created this court. Can't we change it? You follow? Well, of course we can. In this case, we know we can. But the question is the court out of control because of some claim? And, I probably will end with just this one thing. One of the things that I was running into when this whole conversation was going up with relation to the Claremont decisions was, how is it that 3 justices, not 5, 3 justices can change the Constitution by interpretation? And this House has to get 240 people together on the same page and go through this vast process to just put it back where it was. I mean, what the heck kind of thing is that? So I'm just trying to get around with some sort of hit the road kind of illustrations to show why, in my opinion, based on what people are dealing with and suffering with, we need to get back the power to the people, the most beautiful thing, that power of, by, and for the people, which includes power over the courts. And with that, thank you very much.
Thank you all, gentlemen. I really appreciate you coming here tonight and spending the time. And we're going to have a question and answer time. If you have some questions, please feel free to ask. I do also sit on the Redress of Grievance Committee. I'm the sitting clerk. And I definitely take a visceral approach. I'm not as eloquent as these gentlemen. I clean carpets. Okay? I'm a small businessman. I'm a singer. I'm your average guy. But one of the things that really narrows it down is this. If the courts are making rules that are hurting the people, you as an individual, do you have a right to go to that judge and say, Your Honor, this is a bad rule? What do you think? Do you think he's going to listen to you? Exactly. Do you have any authority? The only authority you have is through your legislature. They are your voice. We are your representation. And if we don't have that representation, then we have an unbalanced power. We have a court which has insulated itself from the people. And that is what I've discovered just sitting on this committee and learning from these, and I will say it, great men. And they are my mentors in many ways. And so I see, as a common man, the abuses that are happening to the people. And they're crying. Some people are burning themselves on the steps. Thomas Ball because he can't get justice. And as Representative Mirski said, and Itse, and Sorg, and Ingbretson, that is our primary function, is to provide justice. So with that, I will take any questions. Please, ask me some questions. Or ask the panel questions. Sir.
Thank you. I saw several of the videos from your website, and I wanted to ask Representative Ingbretson a right-brain question. These are heartbreaking stories. How do you deal with it? You need to be some kind of a therapist or something just to listen to these people, to be empathetic. How do you deal with it?
And you know what? This is going to be a little difficult because we want to record this. So Representative Ingbretson, how do you answer?
You know, I've had any number of chairmen of other committees ask the same question. I don't know. You become a rep because you're empathetic in the first place. And I think the hard part is actually seeing that this person has been without a child for so long, or a child without a parent for so long. And it seems to be wrong in the first place. On the face of it, there seems to be no legitimate reason the person hasn't been found guilty of child molestation or, And by the way, in one of these cases, we had a guy who had lost his kid and hadn't been able to see her for 2 or 3 years. And it turns out that one of our departments that he's coming in with redress to complain against, one of the departments had exculpatory evidence, absolute black and white evidence. And the only reason he got a hold of it was because somebody in the department exposed it to him and just wouldn't tell who they were. But how in the heck was that guy going to get justice? So there's a bunch of stuff like that as well. But I thank you for the question. I find that I enjoy it, and I actually got the best part maybe out of it is you learn to be sort of clinical. You say, just show us what really happened, show us the document, and then the tears come anyway. I mean, but that sort of stuff. But the fact is, what are we here for? It's for the people, and if we can maintain it, I don't find it stressful. The other part of it is I actually found I was dealing with like 8 and 10 different departments. I learned more about the government in 2 years than I had in 8 on the Education Committee.
Representative Sorg happens to sit to my left, and honestly, Representative Ingbretson has to kick me to calm me down.
Yes, we have to reel it in all the time.
I'll ask a question that I had meant to ask. That's what I was searching for, so I knew I had 2 questions I wanted to leave you with. This proposed amendment is often presented by its opponents as a separation of powers and a checks and balances issue. We're going to adversely affect the checks and balances between the 3 branches. We all learn about that in 8th grade civics, don't we? So when people say that to me, I ask them, tell me what the effective check is of the legislative branch against the judicial branch. Effective check. We have the impeachment power, we have the power of address, but they're useless because they're so personal. If you have a grievance against the judiciary as an institution, you don't deal with that by impeaching individual justices or individual judges. So it's useless. And Thomas Jefferson said 200 years ago, impeachment isn't even a scarecrow. And we have the power of the purse. And that's true enough. But what are we going to do? Are we going to starve the judiciary? We're just going to zero out their budget and close down the courts? Of course we're not going to do that. So that's not effective either. There is no effective legislative check against the judicial branch now. They've managed to, through a very effective public relations process they've been doing for the last 50 years, insulated themselves. And as Jefferson said, they've made themselves, he was speaking of the federal judiciary, of course, but it's true here now. They've made themselves independent of the state. And we're trying to restore their accountability, which they're required under Article 8 to be. Magistrates are supposed to be accountable. And that's said to be problematical as a separation of powers and a question. So
if you get a question, just yell it out, and then we'll have the person repeat it.
Can I make a...
I'd like a little more elaboration of what is it, Rule 1.2, and how that affects what specific court you're talking about, and where they just say there are no.
I'll quote.
They don't even have to say that. How does that work?
I'll quote the rule. The Supreme Court, under its authority under Article 73B, 73A, has promulgated comprehensive rules for the courts. District Court Rule, however, District Court Rule 1.1 says, as good cause appears and as justice shall require, the court may waive the application of any rule except where precluded by law. So they can decide, without telling you why they're doing it, They've just decided justice requires waiving a rule. So in effect, there are no rules. As an attorney, I got out of doing trial work many years ago because I became so frustrated. You go from one court to another, unless you know the judge intimately, you know his style, you go to a court and you don't know what to expect. I was in a case where not just hearsay, and not just second-hand hearsay, but third-hand hearsay was actually allowed in a neglect and abuse case. The witness testifies, well, he said that, she said that, he said that this happened. And I was just dumbfounded. How do you deal with that as an attorney trying to defend a mother falsely accused of neglecting her child? So that's the rule we're talking about, I think.
Some RSAs that do those cover some rules that the judiciary has to follow, like supreme to their own rules, above their own rules?
Well, I'll talk to that.
Could you repeat the question?
The question was, does the legislature have laws that are superior to the court rules that deal with this issue? And the answer to that is, well, certainly as you heard in the district court, it says that they may waive any rule except where precluded by law. So in the district court, yes, that's true. The same kind of waiver exists in the superior and probate courts in the preamble to their rules, neither of which give the recognition of statute of law. And as we saw in the family court, it has what was just read as Rule 1.1 is Rule 1.2 in the family court, and it does give the recognition of statute, except that if you look at the jurisdiction of the family court, that's all wiped out. You have to understand what an equity court is. And the superior and the superior and probate courts also have equity jurisdiction. It arises out of 15th century English law. The common law having become so complicated, the English Parliament created what they called courts of chancery, which I guess is taking your chances, you know. But that was to be effective. You resorted to courts of chancery because the common law was so complicated, it relied on the last decision in that type of case, and it was just ganglerious. But they were eventually just as bad as the common law, and they were outlawed in the 1800s, about the time that we created the same thing as equity courts in the United States. And equity courts are established for when there is no law to govern the particular circumstance. So when there is no law, the court has the power to do what they believe to be equitable. Now, in the superior and probate courts, it is very clearly stated that they have equity jurisdiction in an enumerated list of cases, or types of cases, when there's no governing statute. Okay, I can buy that. But in the family courts, it says, law to the contrary notwithstanding, they have equity jurisdiction in the following cases, which happen to be all the types of cases that come before them. And so, though their Rule 1.2 gives tacit recognition to statute, their jurisdiction says the statutes are off the table. Right. So, and I should say the district court has no equity jurisdiction. They deal only with statute because they are a criminal court. So the answer is, you're pretty safe in superior and probate court. You're very safe in district court in regard to statute, though they can waive the rules. In family court, they are entirely lawless. They recognize our laws just enough to make us think that we have some effect and to keep us off their backs. But that's about to change.
This all gets pretty dense, eh? Gets kind of hard to follow. I want to try to just give you a couple of, help maybe reel some of this in. I get lost in all this. I think Greg Sorg is one of the greatest attorneys I have ever met. And I think it's between he and Itse, you have the enormous constitutional knowledge, and it's a fabulous thing. And if you ever get a chance to spend time with either one of them talking, You could go on for days and you would be fascinated and you would learn more than you could ever possibly imagine. But for all of us, the average citizen, it really is pretty straightforward. I want to go right back to Locke at the very beginning. Locke made his bones in the 17th century debunking the divine right of kings. That's how he made his reputation. And when he wrote two treatises of government, he couldn't very well say the divine power rests in the people, because he just debunked divinity, the divine rule. What he did was he changed the entire dynamic. He took divinity out of it and he said that you are a free person based upon really your assertion for freedom. These rights you have come solely, pretty much, from a free person has the right of conscience, the right to travel, the right to speak, the right to do all of these things that are in our Constitution. And when you create a free government and you have a consistent of free people, and you write a constitution that says the power always derives from the people, it always resides with the people, you create a legislature that you give all the power to the people's representatives, it's telling you something about our Constitution in New Hampshire, and it's telling you that that is infinitely more important than any claim by any other branch, the judiciary in particular, the judiciary in this case, that they could ever have. How could a judiciary have inherent power? It is impossible in the context of understanding human freedom. You cannot have a free government with an agency, in this particular case, a branch of government, the judiciary, claiming it is free from public oversight. That's the essential message here. No entity, the governor, the legislature is subject to election every 2 years. You don't like us, you throw our butts out. I may have that experience this fall in my own district, and I redistricted myself there. So the people can throw their representatives out in this state every 2 years, every one of them, from governor on down. But when you have a judiciary which is appointed essentially subject to a good behavior, which is essentially for life unless they're impeached or addressed, and that entity just decides that no matter what the legislature says about it, whether it's security in the courtrooms or any other decision by the legislature having to do with law, rules, etc., if you have a judiciary that says that that's unconstitutional because it somehow violates its inherent power, then what you have done is you've created a king in your courts. So that's the importance of Article 2. The whole point of it is to restore judicial oversight over rulemaking. And I thought it was fascinating. You need to remember, if you talk to anybody between now and the election, that my bill essentially proposed to repeal 73A. To go back to 1977, before we even created this device. And the judges, realizing that scared the bejesus out of them, they went and actually thought about this, tried to develop a relationship, reform or reestablish a relationship between themselves and the legislature. And the justices, proposed this language that's on the ballot. It's their languages. All 5 justices, Justice Hicks, Justice Lynn came to the Senate committee hearing on this subject when it went to the Senate, and they brought that language to the legislature. And the legislature embraced that language. So all 5 justices, all 5 sitting justices, agree with this proposal. At the same time, their sycophants in the judiciary are now coming out saying the judges are somehow intimidated by the legislature, this and that, and they're trying, the rest of the bar, the rest of many other people, including Merrill and Netto and others, and even the Chief Justice, the past Chief Justice Broderick, are saying that this is a bad idea. But you can't give a kind of divine power to your judiciary. You have to retain power over your courts. That's essential. And finally, when you think about critiques and whether or not your justices are necessarily the best person for the job, when Justice Broderick was appointed, he was appointed by Governor Merrill, his law partner. Now, judges are no different from anybody in this room. They're human beings. They have their own interests. They have their own foibles. They have their own prejudices, and some of them are political. So giving that kind of authority to individuals who are not appointed necessarily because they happen to be great constitutional scholars, but appointed perhaps they only have political connections, makes the idea of an independent, unapproachable, all-powerful judiciary insane.
I want to drop back for a minute, and Representative Sorg mentioned Merrill versus Sherburne, and so did Representative Ingbretson. It's really important to understand the structure of our controversies. Now, Article 17 talks about the venue of criminal prosecutions. It clearly gives jurisdiction to the judiciary of criminal cases, the state against the person or the people. And Article 20, which talks about tort law, civil cases, in referring to a jury, also clearly gives jurisdiction to the judiciary in cases of one person against another person. But Article 32, which is the people against the government, is clearly given to the People's Court, the General Court, for its adjudication. Now, what happened for the first 35 years of our republic, almost all law was introduced to the General Court via petition. And the majority of the petitions were in regard to the judiciary. And they were typically losses of due process. One, Mrs. McClary versus I can't remember whom, she was in England, and one of her relatives died, and they held the probate case, and she came back from England and found that the estate that should have gone to her had gone to someone else. And so she entered a petition to the General Court, and the General Court said, gee, there's been a loss of due process here. She wasn't apprised of the hearings. And so what the legislature did was say, judiciary, go look at this again, because there was a problem here. Well, this was pretty frequent. Now, remember I said that the legislature had the power to wipe out the courts. I talked about 1816, 1818, Federalists to Republican Democrat, back to Federalists, and wipe out the judiciary. And what happened was you lost all institutional memory in government. Concurrent with this, all the founding fathers are dying. They've left government. John Langdon is probably the most quintessential. He died in 1819. He had left government in 1813. And the judiciary came down with, you had, I think it was another probate will case, Merrill versus Sherburne, and the petition was entered, and the legislature said do-over. And this was then appealed to the judiciary, and the judiciary said, oh, but this violates Article 37, separation of powers. It's a familiar cry. So the public relations effort that was referred to by Representative Sorg as being the last 50 years has really been more like the last 150 years. Almost 200 years, 1819, we're now 2012. So we're just 190 years of jurisprudence. They said Merrill versus Sherburne violates Article 37 to have this petition answered. And interestingly, in their decision, the court referenced Article 37. They referenced Article 31, which talks about us assembling for the redress of public grievances, and they focused on that word public. They never once in their decision referred to Article 32, which was the people's right of redress before the General Court. And they then went on and they talked about Federalist Paper 47, authored by James Madison, and they referred to the writings of Montesquieu. And they said, well, see, Montesquieu talks about whenever one power of government exercises the powers of another branch of government, this is tyranny, and that's how Montesquieu refers to it. And Madison said, this may be termed the very definition of tyranny. You notice they didn't use the whole sentence. What Madison said was, when all three powers of government rest in the same set of hands, whether elected, appointed, or hereditary, this may be termed the very definition of tyranny. By pulling a sentence fragment out and attributing it to the whole, they misrepresented the intent of the authors. Earlier in Federalist Paper 47, Madison describes the same writings of Montesquieu, not a sentence fragment pulled out, but the whole paragraph. And he says Montesquieu was talking about whole agency, the legislature being the judiciary, or the executive being the judiciary, and not partial agency, because he was extolling the virtues of partial agency in the English government. And he then went on to say, and you know what? Of all the constitutions, only New Hampshire got it right with our presentation of Article 37. Because while all the other constitutions of the various states called for an absolute separation of powers, only New Hampshire recognized that partial agency was necessary in order to maintain free government. Let me finish. What they got the people to believe, and they got the legislature to believe, is that the people who wrote the Constitution, ratified the Constitution, and practiced for the Constitution for the first 35 years did not understand it. And it took this enlightened group who had nothing to do with it to properly understand it. And that's the same kind of thing that's going on today.
Well said. Are there any more questions? Yes, go ahead.
If the courts are acting as if they have this inherent right, what kind of justification do they put forth to justify their, how do they justify their actions? What are they,
Why do they justify their action? They justify it using...
Why did they justify it?
They justify it using Article 37. This article that Representative Itse has quoted a number of times, and they completely misinterpret it in their own interest. That's the only thing I can tell you, is they take 37 and they turn the meaning he just described to you on its head. And they say over and over again to the legislature, to the Judiciary Committee, or any other committee where they appear, they take Article 37 and they say that 37 means absolute separation of powers. And it's Orwellian in a sense. And as maybe someone said here early, when you read particularly the phrase, as a free government will admit, you cannot have a free government with an autonomous judiciary or autonomous branch of government of any kind. You cannot have it. So Representative Itze's interpretation is correct. You have to have this check. It's uniform among the branches. You can't have a branch that's autonomous, which is what the court says. And what the court has been doing really since the 80s, when it realized that 78A could be abused this way, it's gradually gathered more and more power into itself until just a couple years ago. I'm affected by this. I filed a number of bills in the past, in the late 90s and early and maybe 2000, to create an administrative office of the court, to separate the court, to basically have an entity that would do all the administrative functions and leave the judges to working on the bench, pretty much as it does in the United States Supreme Court. And the court regularly opposed that idea until finally, somewhere between 2006 and 2010, they came to the legislature and they proposed creating an administrative office. No, they didn't come to the legislature. I misspoke. On their own, they legislated the creation of an administrative office of the court. They, without any public hearings of any kind, they created a state agency, in essence. That's a blatant overreach. It's a blatant legislative act. And they've never been called on it by the legislature. So they're willing, they want to coalesce power. Any entity, if you read Machiavelli or read anybody who's written on power, it's always the interest of the persons in power to coalesce, gather power into themselves wherever they can gather it. And this court has been doing it pretty consistently since 1978 when 73A was adopted. So you watch the court something you might do sometime. I don't know how crazy about the stuff you could possibly get after this amount of time. But if you're interested, you pick up a copy of the New Hampshire Constitution, and you go to the section that speaks to the judiciary, and you look at the dates of the amendments since about the mid-50s. And what you will see is this gradual aggregation of power from amendment to successive amendment to successive amendment to successive amendment to successive amendment. This is not something that happened just by magic. I think that the idea that they had to somehow get out from underneath public oversight really is strong after the Second World War, and they just worked very slowly over time to accomplish this end. And they, coming back to the beginning, and they use a perversion of Part 1, Article 37 to justify it. It's quite phenomenal if once you understand the history and the language of this Constitution. I don't know, we're getting pretty late here, huh?
One last word. I have a case of constitutions in my car.
Oh, good.
So if anybody wants to come down and get one, I'd be happy to hand them out because I get them for free from the Secretary of State. Also, because of Paul Mirski...
Anybody can get these.
Right, yeah. But then you have to drive up there.
Yeah, right.
And I'm going to blame this one on Paul because it's his fault. In 2006, we had a great controversy regarding the ballots, and the legislature had told the Secretary of State how to publish the ballots. And the Supreme Court looked at the ballots, and they had created these super enormous districts in 2002 that had, 12, 13 legislators running in the district. And they said, we have this thing called primacy, that some people, they're going to go into the ballot box and they're just going to vote for the first person they see on the, they're going to go top down. They're not going to figure out, they're not going to take the time to figure out who they want to vote for, which really means they think you're stupid. That's the short interpretation. But because of this, we can't list people's names alphabetically on the ballot beginning with A. So they told the Secretary of State to do something else, and I looked up Article 29, and it says the power of suspending the laws or the execution of them ought never to be exercised but by the legislature or authority derived therefrom to be exercised in such particular cases as only the legislature shall expressly provide for. And so we're making these arguments, and we got the legislature to reconvene itself, and though there were, through some faux pas, we failed to pass the legislation, we did attempt to tell the Secretary of State to publish the ballot as we had told him to, and that's what he wanted. But as a result of that, he said, you're writing all these great constitutional arguments, you should write a commentary on the Constitution. So after all the hubbub was over, I said, did you really mean that? And he said, yes, he did. And so I did the only rational thing possible, being an engineer. I wrote a commentary on the Constitution, which is, by the way, how we found redress of grievances.
Created a monster.
But I have copies of that commentary available. So if you want one, see me down afterward.
We'll close with Representative Sorg.
Yeah, I wanted to answer the question that was actually asked.
We've been learning from
the question, and I remember it too. The question was, how does the court justify what it does, these extra things it does? It does it because beyond just having the power to hear and adjudicate cases, it claims to have inherent powers to do other things too that are like corollary to its core functions. So some years ago, when the legislature passed a law replacing court security with the Sheriff's Department, the court said, no, it's inherent, we have inherent authority to govern the doings in our own courtroom, so they could hire who they wanted to act as bailiffs and guard the courtroom. And they also have claimed inherent authority to regulate members of the bar, which yours truly is a member. And they claim inherent authority to require me to support that organization. What other things have they claimed inherent authority to do over this? But that's the answer. They think anything that is tangentially related to performance of their core functions of hearing and deciding cases, they claim to have the authority to do it. And that's why they've reached out, and so now they exercise legislative and executive powers and claim to be very hurt by the fact that we're trying to call them on it.
Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you, folks, for being part of this event. And thank you, Thomas More College, for letting us have part of this. Remember, vote yes. CACR 26 on the ballot. And question 2.